Okay, maybe I should start with exactly that. Hooray. We've got reason for celebration, and at least in this respect. I mean, it's over for now, and the other guy won. And if you saw the beginning of this lecture series in October, you notice which other fight hasn't been won yet. That's the one against coronavirus, COVID-19, because in October, for my first lecture here, the first one that I signed responsible for the whole thing, I was clean shaven, and by now I look like Animal from the Muppet Show. I excuse myself for that. I'm not sure if I should excuse myself for what I'm going to start with, because just for once, I'm going to say something nice about Donald Trump. Something he would like to hear. These last 4 years were a pretty captivating performance. I mean, we all got a mega exciting, often breathtaking roller coaster ride for our money, didn't we? Trump was a reasonably good performer. You can't imagine how much I like talking about him in the past tense. Anyway, I can see how, if one forgets for a moment what he was saying and what he was doing for the past 5 years, how his shows were entertaining to watch. Trump is still a media person. He was generated by the media. There's a mixture here of stand-up comedian, revivalist preacher, and used car salesman. No, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about Donald Trump. Trump can be quite funny. He has a good handling of pauses and of timing jokes, even though his grimacing is a bit over the top. There are elements of a religious revival megachurch preacher here, with his somewhat rambling rhetoric, the reductionist repetition of messages. There's a certain limitation also of gestures and mimics. If you look at recordings of his rallies, you notice that he always uses the same set of gestures, like this pointer here, which is a signature piece, but it was actually introduced by another showman in office, Bill Clinton. Actually, it goes even further back than that. Reagan uses it, Kennedy uses it, so this is one of the standing things that presidents do. Even Joe Biden did it yesterday. If you saw after he was done with everything and was going to turn in, he quickly ran back to the rostrum and pointed at the audience, at the soldiers somehow. But with him, it's slightly out of character. He's just not that kind of rhetorician. We'll get back to that. For Trump, a characteristic is this, "Can I hear you?" Worked as a prompter for the "build that wall" or "lock her up" chants. Or, of course, this Frankie Sinatra finish. New York, New York. A handful of gestures, some 150 standing phrases and motif chains did for all these years. They were the greatest phrases in history, of course, of American rhetoric, believe me. No one would have thought that the president could do with so little eloquence. But then the man proved to be an extremist in a variety of ways, including his reductionist tendencies in rhetoric. Not even a pretense to be differentiating, to be weighing options. Always exaggerated, always full throttle, from the inauguration through to the end. And the only thing that would deter him from this course of action is not contradiction, nor active resistance, but ironic mockery. the Tyler Linfesti case in 2018. No, that's the plaid shirt guy in between him looking slightly incredulous. You know, did he really just say that? Linfesti claimed that he did not actually plan to disturb or even to be a distraction. He was a case of the emperor's new clothes phenomenon, insofar as he claimed that his grimacing was a direct reaction to being one of the few people in the audience who were not either placed within camera range to suggest enthusiasm. He claims that there was a woman who came up to him and said she was going to replace him, where once somebody monitoring the cameras noticed his reactions. And then he was escorted out of the place by the Secret Service. So this is something we have to take into account when seeing a Trump rally. And then there are those ready to be caught up and swept away in the surge of hysteria that is this show was likely to generate. Yeah. Watching these shows is a bit like watching Goebbels' Sportpalastrede. I know, one shouldn't always sort of compare Trump and everything else to the fascists, but it is like that. There is a mode and a manner of speaking here which is aiming at arousing the audience. And at the worst, as we saw on January 6th, to incite a mob. Do I believe Trump did this on purpose? Of course I do. He's too adept at showmanship not to know what he was doing. Posing as Uncle Sam, who was originally on a recruitment poster for the US Army, both repeats the pointer gesture and makes his supporters into American soldiers, fighting against the enemies of America, or in this case, the enemies of Trump. Equally, of course, he will deny it once he will hopefully be facing charges of sedition in court sometime in the future. Do I understand why people followed him all the way to the Capitol, to the point where they were ready to trade in an autocratic Führer for the democracy they still live in? I believe I do. Attendees of Trump rallies interviewed by media all speak of a feeling of community, of being addressed personally, of feeling represented by this man, this clown, this showmaster. There's a huge task ahead of the political system of the US if they want to convince these people that they're also being listened to by them, being meant by the inclusive we in political rhetoric, including yesterday's inaugural address. The saddest spectacle of all around Epiphanias this year was the lack of epiphanies on the part of Trump's lackeys and lapdogs in what used to be the Republican Party. The best we can hope for is a rift so big that it will result in a split of the Republicans into what used to be the conservative grand old party of the US and the Trump movement, which is a reactionary, para-religious, fascist leader cult. Which brings us to the one considerable and increasingly disparaging problem about Trump's performance, and with that I'm through saying nice things about the Donald. Trump did not perform the role of the most recent ex-president of the United States. Not ever. In all 4 of those incredibly long years, which did not seem to end. Trump performed Trump, because Trump is the only one role that Trump is able to perform. And of course, his show only works as long as he is the absolute and unbridled centerpiece of the show. And this is all I'm going to say about Trump, at least for now, because I'm aiming to talk about performing the presidency. And Trump missed performing the role of the President of the United States by at least the length of a golf course. He was the worst president ever, not just in terms of his actions and his legacy, which will take a lot of time and effort to clear up, but even in terms of his performance in office. The performance of the presidency, like any other performance as the head of a state, is of course about performing power. The performance of this power is based on three pillars. There he goes. Business, leadership, and synthesis, which needs a bit of explanation, because as Calvin Coolidge is often somewhat misquoted, the chief business of the American people is business. But this does not only encompass, as Coolidge phrased it, buying, selling, producing, and consuming, but actually doing something, not sitting idly back, being concerned with the job you're doing at hand. There is a Protestant work ethos here, which is why James Buchanan gets such a bad rap. He's third worst president of the United States. In a country that was falling apart, he did nothing. This failure to be busy with his business also resulted in a lack of leadership. And like any leadership situation imbued with such power, it always has a spiritual, religious component, especially in times of trouble, following a catastrophe, for instance. Depending on the outlook of those craving to be led, there is a military component too, and a strongly masculine one, which explains posters like this one. Mm-hmm. And ridiculous shows of strength like this one. And it even explains why Margaret Thatcher jumped at the chance that the asinine Argentine occupation of the Falklands in 1982 presented her with. Synthesis, at the other end of the scale, means the ability to unite the warring fractions within the party system and the wider populace. And no other moment in a president's storyline is as much designed for feeding this spirit of synthesis than the Inauguration Address. The Inaugural Address has always been, in the tradition of Washington, and even more so of Lincoln after him, a healing speech. There are two grand occasions on which Americans regularly celebrate themselves: the 4th of July every year and the presidential inaugural every 4 years. Of the regular speeches on those days, the Inaugural Address is the happier one. Following more or less confrontational election campaigns, the aim for the newly sworn-in president must be to bind up the wounds, mend the fissures, and present himself as the president for all, which is what Trump purposefully failed to do in 2017, and what Joe Biden did already throughout his whole campaign, and predictably again yesterday. The standard inaugural has this synthetic urge at its center. The inclusive we is prominent. There's a lot of thanking all around, including usually the outgoing administration. Did you notice that? That was noticeably absent yesterday because Biden managed to thank the former presidents present, which excluded, unfortunately, old Jimmy Carter, who at 97 didn't make it to Washington, but it also excluded the other one, the most recent ex-president of the United States. The inaugural address is a prodeictic speech focused on the prospects of the coming years. New presidents must be careful not to promise too much. So there's usually a review of the current situation, as challenging, even threatening. That was easy to do yesterday. But together we can do it, like in all the standard Hollywood movies, there will be a happy ending. The surrounding pomp and circumstances follows a time-honored ritual with a considerable amount of military and police presence, prayers, and of course performances. A song star gives their rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, and a poem commissioned for the occasion from a poet laureate is read. That one was a particular highlight yesterday. Given this strongly prearranged and deterministic frame, it comes as a bit of a surprise to which extent the inaugurals of those 44 men who managed to be 45 presidents anticipated their performances in office. You're wondering, eh? Well, comes later. And there has been, of course, a wide array of differing performances, leaving as widely differing impressions and legacies. Everybody at least knows the names of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, while few people, including Americans, will ever have heard of, recognize him, anybody? Millard Fillmore, or Chester Arthur, which may have to do with the fact that these two are among the 4 US presidents who were never elected, as opposed to the one who was elected 4 times. I could get money out of this if this was a quiz show now. Anyway, one thing they all shared in common, at least until, no, not the most recent ex-president, but this one, the 35th one, was a certain Protestant frugality and matter-of-factness that made them an oddity on the world scene at first. From the start, at least in theory, the American presidency differed widely from the performance of the absolutist regimes that were in charge around the world at the time. It has more to do with having the honor of being in the chair of a selection of dignitaries, or functionaries rather, a strongly de-hierarchized position compared to the exaggerated self-importance and effusive splendor of a Louis XVI or a Charles I. Today we think the American president has a lot of power. By comparison, it was considerably less, which may ask for 1 or 2 reforms at some point. By the later 17th and certainly 18th century, the absolute powers of many kings, of course, had given way to an amount of parliamentary control, and the bourgeois middle class finance capital-based sense of accountability, if not outright Calvinism. But even in a predominantly Catholic countries, an irresponsible monarch could suddenly find himself without a place to wear his crown, to quote Alan Sherman. Now, the French Revolution started 10 weeks after George Washington was inaugurated as the first POTUS on April 30th, 1789. Washington's performance as president was considerably more low profile than his aggrandization into a mythical hero figure later and in the 19th century would make one expect. A key term in this context is fameworthiness. This does imply a sense of duty, something an absolute monarch had brought up. The Prussian King Frederick sported the motto, Ich dien, I serve, and personally he certainly did, and his lifestyle was also anything but extravagant. Washington went further, talking about how taking over the position of a president meant for him the, quote, forfeiture of all expectations of private happiness in this world. This was probably an exaggeration, but it indicated the spirit of republicanism. This is the time period when Republican subjects started to self-organize in all sorts of organizations and did not rely on God's blessing, the charity of the churches, or the benevolence of the state to get things done, and for instance, to provide for public safety systems. To serve, for instance, on a volunteer fire engine team was then considered an honor, and members from all classes and venues of life ran with the machine, as they were known. Politics, of course, at the time was not for everybody. The Declaration of Independence is all men are created equal really meant all propertied white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are created equal, but even this polite egalitarianism in among an elite of gentlemen of means, many of them landowners and even slaveholders, did not keep already the second president from not attending the inauguration of the third. See, there was one who wasn't a fireman. The first election showing that there was something grievously wrong with the American electoral system was the one in 1824, when there were 4 candidates, all from the same party. The one who got the most votes was an outsider, the anti-elitist and war hero of 1812, Andrew Jackson. But John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, who had not attended the inauguration of the third, teamed up with another strong elitist who had received the least votes of the 4 to override the popular vote, even though their common abhorrence of Jackson and their belief in classical rhetoric were just about the only things that united Adams and Henry Clay. Jackson was the first anti-elite populist. Still, he conceded in 1824 and waited for his moment in 1828. Jackson's supporters started the election campaign for 2028 already in 2024. Jackson was nominated in 2025. Thus, there was for the first time this sort of eternal election campaign that US politics has become since. I hope I'm talking about the past 20s of 200 years ago and not about the future 20s that we are entering into. Jackson was disliked, if not downright hated, by some of the elite in Washington. And John Quincy Adams repeats the inglorious performance of his father and does not attend the inauguration. Jackson was a self-styled simple man. And so simple, actually, that supposedly we owe the okay to him. Because reading through ledgers of documents, he would note on the margins whether he had everything was sort of understood fine with him, and he wrote all clear, which he sometimes abbreviated to OK, because he spelled all clear O-R-L-C-K-L-E-E-R. That was Jackson, supposedly. That's where OK comes from. As a Democrat, his ideals closely resembled Jefferson's. But he relied strongly on appointing people to political offices who had supported him, introducing that way the so-called spoils system, by which public office became the pork barrel that it continues to be to this day. This was, of course, exactly the opposite of the meritocratic idea that originally fueled American republicanism and American democracy. Thus, he's a highly controversial figure to this day, which is probably why the most recent ex-president of the United States hung his portrait in the Oval Office. It would fill another lecture to explain everything that Trump misunderstood about Jackson. This was the first populist campaign, but it was absolutely dwarfed by the big show events in 1840 when another war hero tried to become president, William Henry Harrison, nicknamed Old Tippecanoe after a battle he won in the War of 1812. So he died 3 weeks into his first term because he had gone to his inaugural without a coat and a hat, and it was very cold that day in Washington. But he left us a legacy of image cards, the log cabins. He was called the log cabin and hard cider candidate, trying to copy Jackson's populism. Also, songs like this one, attacking the physical features of his enemy. It's Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And that's how we beat little Van. Van is a used-up man. That's not very nice, is it? And distributing these mechanical cards isn't particularly nice either. So showing Van Buren as a member of the Washington aristocracy. You may now notice that a lot of things that are about the campaign and the self-stylization of the most recent ex-president of the United States really have their origins and forebears in the 19th century already. It's not as if he didn't try to learn from history, but he learned all the wrong things. Affinity to technology is also a factor introduced by Harrison in his very costly campaign. So the locomotive engine overrides the stagecoach. From here on, election campaigns and subsequently inaugurations become a show, and a costly one at that. Lincoln's campaign had all the works of showmanship. I have at home a Lincoln campaign button. There's a songster. Campaign biographies were written by people not that well known yet. Lincoln's was written by none other but William Dean Howells. And carte de visite photographies were 16 to $1 at the time, so they could be distributed more. They're worth quite something, particularly if they've been signed by Lincoln on the back. P.T. Barnum is a showmaster of the period who gives us an idea of what the Lincoln campaign was all about. He is, after Jackson, the second really populist president. Originally a Whig, he had embraced the new republicanism of the Republican Party. He had a very good timing. His voice wasn't particularly well suited for rhetoric, but very good timing, jokes, which left some of the establishment abhorred, but the people liked it. He showed a certain authoritarianism in dealing with media. Anything he considered fake news could result in a newspaper being shut down, particularly during the war. But he'd learned something from P.T. Barnum, who was a contemporary, if not a friend. That's him with the one of his showmen, Tom Thumb, really George Stratton, an Englishman. Because it was not Lincoln, to whom this is sometimes accredited, it was Barnum who actually said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And besides, if anybody was business during his time as American president, it was Lincoln. If you look at how he looked for the Cooper Union address in 1860, and the last Brady photograph in March 1865, weeks before he was assassinated, it looks as if the man didn't sleep for those 4 years. Of course, he had a civil war at his hands too. But he gave us in his second inaugural address the most memorable of them all, notably in terms of synthesis. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Mind you, the war isn't even over by this time. Now, this is March 1865. They're still fighting in Virginia. They're still fighting in Tennessee. They're still fighting in North Carolina. But he's already looking ahead, as I said. Now, this is one of the most important things in an inaugural address, this prospect of a better future. It's probably and arguably Lincoln's second inaugural address, which results in inaugural addresses becoming a centerpiece for attention. Until then, there had not really been a specific presidential speech that was this important or that much attention also being paid to. Lincoln starts this. Perhaps anybody could have only done wrong in the aftermath of a bloody fight like the Civil War, trying to steer a course between those who wanted reunion above all and the Federals who wanted revenge. Biden is fortunately in a bit better situation here. I don't see the revenge part on the side of the Democrat left. Lincoln himself might have failed in this situation, but Lincoln was dead and could be and was declared a martyr and practically beatified. A singularly ill-advised moment in US history, however, had made the Tennessean Andrew Johnson his running mate and thus successor in office. Johnson was of very poor origins, had no school education at all, a tailor by trade. He had been the only sitting senator from a secession state not to quit in 1861, and Lincoln had appointed him military governor of Tennessee in 1862. This seemed to be a fitting message of reunion in the difficult 1864 campaign. Johnson, after taking over, issued a series of proclamations directing the seceded states to hold conventions and elections to reform their governments. And he sent Carl-Schurz, welcome all of the audience, members of the audience who are here via the Carl-Schurz-Haus. Carl-Schurz on a tour then did not act on Schurz's findings and recommendations from that tour through the defeated Confederate South. So when southern states tried to get their old leaders back in and passed so-called black codes to deprive the freedmen of many civil liberties, Republicans in Congress advanced legislation to overrule these actions. Johnson vetoed those bills. Congressional Republicans overrode his vetoes, setting a pattern for the remainder of his presidency. Johnson also opposed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenships to former slaves, and an important thing in the present situation, and 14th Amendment, Section 3, barred anyone who had reneged against a U.S. oath of office, that would include the presidential office, inciting insurrection, from holding official positions. This is the way to get rid of the most recent ex-president of the United States forever. Johnson was also the second worst president of the United States, and he was the last one, until the most recent ex-president of the United States, to not attend the inauguration of his successor. But then we have one who actually attended the inaugurations of his successors twice, because Grover Cleveland was both the 22nd and the 24th president. Here's the solution to that riddle I asked earlier. The Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1876 signals another dark day in the performance of the presidency, and one that the presidency and the office of the president has been sort of suffering from ever since. If there ever was a presidential election in US history that was stolen, it was this one. Stooping to an all-time low, before the most recent ex-president of the United States, spreading the lie about his election going to be and then having been stolen from him. To be sure, American elections had already before this time and definitely after not always and indisputably been fair, free, and equal. There had been problems with the presidential and vice presidential elections in 1824, as I said. There had been and continued to be into the 20th century voter intimidation, buying votes, gerrymandering districts so that they would return the right number of votes for the right party, casting votes illegally, and all that had happened before, but mostly on the lower echelons, like voting for a mayor or a sheriff, a county or state elections. Corruption was rampant under the Johnson and Grant administrations, and honest John Tilden had, as governor of New York, performed rather well against it, blowing up the Tammany Circle around the infamous Boss Tweed. All the same, the Democrats who nominated him managed to win, for instance, the state of South Carolina with a whopping 101% of the eligible voters of that state. I mean, if you do try to be fraudulent, you should at least be able to count. So there was a considerable amount of fraud, accompanied by threats of violence on a scale like we saw over the last couple of weeks, and definitely more than that. In the end, there were two highly disputed sets of electoral votes from a total of 4 states. And an electoral committee, not unlike the one Ted Cruz was clamoring for, another one who thought he'd learned something from history, decided in favor of Hayes after the famous compromise had been reached. This compromise had never been seen written form, but it meant the federal withdrawal of troops from South Carolina and Louisiana, the last two occupied former Confederate states, the restitution of everything but chattel slavery to pre-war power conditions, and it meant throwing Southern Republicans and the African-American population to the dogs. So if anything ever seriously damaged the reputation of federal politics and the office of the president, before the most recent ex-president's elephantine performance in his own China store, it was this compromise. Hayes had already been an unwanted last-minute compromise candidate for the presidential race for his own party, and he was a clumsy, ill-luck president. During administration, Carl-Schurz, here he is again, tried to, as Minister of the Interior, tried to implement a reform of the civil service that insisted on the holders of government offices at least having a basis of training for what they were supposed to do, rather than being political friends of whoever appointed them. The graft and corruption around office seeking got so bad that the next president, James Garfield, was shot dead by a disappointed office seeker half a year after his inauguration. And yeah, I think I can do it. You start wondering about how many presidents are being shot dead. You know, this is the next one already, William McKinley. Now the US lost another president only 20 years later, and several more had attempts being made at assassinating them. I'm quite surprised. The Secret Service seems to have gotten a lot better. I would have lost a lot of money if anybody had bet with me on the safety of Barack Obama, and I kept waiting for somebody trying to take a shot at Donald Trump, but then the people that love guns and can actually use them were mostly on his side. McKinley is simultaneously the last Civil War president, served as an officer in the Ohio Regiment, and the first president of the media age. That's why I need him here. New media, so we have the acceptance of his nomination as a film, one of the first films ever. And you can hear him on a phonograph wax cylinder with the first ever campaign speech being recorded. Also, look at him, I mean, clean shaven. He tries to present a youthful image. I will shave as soon as I get, as the barbershops open again, promise. Teddy Roosevelt was one of those being shot at who actually arrested the assassin. Another one of those showman figures, important because Populist, not only by his personal appearance and the fact that as vice president he commanded the first US volunteer cavalry in the Cuban War. No, he also gained a lot of positive feedback by his antitrust legislation and his anti-corruption stances. So, interesting figure. Woodrow Wilson is the first one to give a radio speech that was broadcast publicly, but from his home when he was already ailing badly, and the first one to use the radio as a new medium is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So his fireside chats were extremely popular, but they were not implemented because he thought radio was a great thing, but because the newspapers at the time were turning partisan against him. He thought that was fake news, but rather than shutting newspapers down, he found a new medium to get his messages out. The presidents are good at that, whether it be radio, television, or Twitter. Modern showmanship. This is the image, what it's supposed to have been like. This was more like it. But people were actually sitting in front of their radios waiting for his fireside chats, and some of them had even photographs of him propped up next to the radio. So this is not something that the Germans in the 1930s invented. And along comes television, and modern showmanship takes another twist and turn. Now, Walt Disney meets John Kennedy. Someday my prince will come and he won't look like Nixon. Now, radio audiences, hearing the same campaign debate, thought Nixon was more convincing, but on TV, the youthful Kennedy looked so much better that the American people forgave him even for being Irish and Catholic. Now, two factors that were new and would have made him impossible before World War II, probably. Never mind also that his father, old Joe Kennedy, was a mobster along the lines of old man Trump. His older brother, Joe, was really the one who was supposed to be the presidential candidate, but he got killed, and in the war that almost also claimed Jack. Highly decorated Navy officer, Shakespearean family, Kennedy set a new standard for the performance of the presidency, a style and a glitz that fit the size of TV and provided a lifeline for a slate of glitzy magazines and paparazzi photographers worldwide. With Kennedy, the performance of the American presidency became a Hollywood reality show. And this was reflected also already in his inauguration. Kennedy not only got the almost centenarian American poet laureate Robert Frost to produce a rather mediocre poem, he also used the inaugural address for one of the most memorable lines in American rhetorical history. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This first glamour phase of US politics, however, was short. And let's face it, JFK was not a good president. He almost brought about World War III in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he looked good And his wife looked even better. Politics, all of a sudden, was sexy. This was new in American politics, and it ended with the fourth president in American history being killed by an assassin. His successors did not match that performance, couldn't even aspire to it. Johnson, one of the most underrated presidents in American history, did not seek a re-election. And 1968 was a double catastrophe insofar as the Democrat candidate, one Hubert Humphrey, was a huge disappointment to the strong party left, whereas the Republicans brought back Nixon, whose paranoia had only worsened over the years and who did surprisingly well as a president. Funnily enough, Biden and Nixon are the only vice presidents who did not immediately accede to the presidency but had a time period in between. If Biden does as well in external affairs, at least, as Nixon did, I won't complain. He ended the Vietnam War. He sought and found better relations with China, but resigned over one of the most embarrassing moments in US history, known as the Watergate scandal. So there is a certain logic then in the fact that with Ronald Reagan in 1980, we get a real actor as president. Reagan had starred and co-starred in a number of mostly B movies in the 1940s. A staunchly Republican and increasingly liberal Hollywood, he'd gone into politics and served as governor of California. Does this gesture look familiar? The view of Reagan as just an accident of a B-movie actor playing the president has been limited on this aspect far too long. What happened in 1980 is, I claim, just consequential, seeing the development of American politics from a Republican democracy to a plutocratic media technocracy. The postmanesque takeover of the political office by the entertainment industry. From now on, every new president needed to have the big industries and an immense amount of money at his disposal, and he had to have showman qualities. Reagan was also shot at, but not killed, and showman qualities, I mean, gotta hand it to him. When he woke up from the emergency surgery, removing an explosive bullet from his intestines, he said, "I'd rather be in Philadelphia," when asked how he felt. That was an old W.C. Fields line here on the bottom right. And when, about a year or two later, I forget now when exactly that was, somebody exploded a balloon, an air balloon, in the room where he spoke. He stopped for a short second and then said, "Missed me." Takes some nerve to do this kind of thing. Gotta hand it to him. But anyway, next showman, Slick Willie on saxophone. Well, several of the problems that we're facing today, like the lack of control of the banking system, are thanks to the Clintons. But the world seemed more preoccupied with him getting blowjobs from interns than his politics. Now, he looked a lot like Kennedy. He was hailed as another Kennedy, but look at the mess he made out of that. And these successions also become a strange phenomenon. We've had that with John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but I tend to think of that as being more coincidental. There weren't that many people to choose from at the time. However, the connection between Kennedy and Clinton, and then Bush the elder and Bush the younger, and the talk about the sons or possibly the daughter of the most recent ex-president of the United States possibly vying for office at some point. And what's happening here? Are we returning to royal families, royal lineages? But George Bush tried hard, and he had a lot of ill luck. In his first presidency, what happens but 9/11? In his second, you see him here looking out at the devastation that Hurricane Katrina left behind, and starting with his inaugural address, George Bush the younger always had this look on his face as if he'd rather be in Philadelphia. But he wasn't. He was in Washington, and yeah. One of the more pleasant surprises in this century now was the constructive and even amiable handover from George Bush to Barack Obama. The Clinton administration had been reluctant, to put it mildly, and the long delay in the decision who had won also created problems in the transition. Bush set an example for presidential performance at its best when he ushered in the gracious Barack Obama, who, of course, almost immediately became fabulous as a speaker, connecting Martin Luther King and Franklin Roosevelt already on his campaigns, but also bringing in African-American speech. Now, if some of you maybe remember the campaign ads, you can still find them on YouTube. You can find everything on YouTube. You'll be able to see me again next week or so on YouTube when the Carl-Schurz-Haus has uploaded this presentation. Now, there are all these echoes of a 1990s campaign for, I even forget what it was, when these guys would call on each, having a bud, right, what's up, watching the game, having a bud, oh, cool, yeah? So Obama adapted that to, or his campaign adapted that, what's up, and then the answer is change in the end. These guys from the original ads for Budweiser played these characters here that all ask for change. Then, of course, there was all the debate about him already back then, that can we have somebody as president who has African origin, somebody with a name like Barack Hussein Obama. And the typical ironic twist that Obama got into this was that he's also on his mother's side of Irish origin. So watch out again on YouTube for these people in an Irish pub actually singing. O'Leary, O'Reilly, O'Hare and O'Hara, there's no one as Irish as Barack Obama. From the Great Brawny Stone to the Green Hills of Tara, there's no one as Irish as Barack Obama. Hilarious. And then, of course, his inaugural, yes we can. Martin Luther King and Franklin Roosevelt rolled in one and delivered gracefully, and always with this slightly ironic twist. He was a singer, he was a basketball player, always playing just a bit, with this twist to the stereotypically expected behavior of a president. Mr. Bojangles meets Michael Jordan, and Martin Luther King and Franklin Roosevelt look from the clouds and clap. Actually, Bill Bojangles Robinson would have done the same thing. The only one who's still alive is Michael Jordan. And now. Do you remember the Obama years? Who was Joe Biden? Joe Biden was the somehow bland, somewhat colorless, I mean, white hair, white skin, white. You put him in front of a white wall, and he would just disappear, become invisible. Was he somehow spectacular? Would we have believed that he were to become the man who saves us now from the most recent ex-president of the United States? Is this back to normalcy? Which is what Warren Harding said in his inaugural address in 1921. They wanted to get back to normalcy. I would have said normality. Not from the looks of it. The masks, the corona gaps in the audience, the National Guard soldiers, and the police guarding the place. This looked really strange. At the same time, here's Amy Klobuchar talking about the Capitol building, and of course implicitly and explicitly about the attack on it. The building that was not finished yet when Lincoln took office. And he was criticized for continuing to build it, using funds that would have been useful elsewhere too, to build that house. But he said, and Klobuchar quoted him, "If the people see the Capitol going on, they will know the Union is going on." And in a way I thought, okay, here's somebody offering herself as a potential successor in 4 years' time. And then there was Lady Gaga singing the national anthem. I'm not sure if Americans realize that, at least from a German point of view, if you call somebody Gaga, you don't necessarily want them around at your inauguration. But here it seems to be different, and she had long been a Biden and Democrat supporter. So that was spectacular. And then Garth Brooks, which should really shake supporters of the most recent ex-president in their foundations, because everybody thought of him as a more Republican. I mean, this is a country musician. And what he sang, Amazing Grace, which as a song sung at a political occasion we last heard when Barack Obama spoke on the occasion of the funeral of those people shot by a white supremacist crazy kid in South Carolina, where he deviated from the typical expectations of what a president would say in a situation like this, all the way back to Lincoln again and the Gettysburg Address, when Obama started singing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." And that was the last stanza that Garth Brooks sang yesterday, and he invited everybody to sing along. And only that there were only so few people prevented this from becoming one of the largest choirs in American history, if not the largest one. I guess people sang at their TV sets and computers. I know I did. And then there's 22-year-old, can you believe it, Amanda Gorman, with a great performance of a poem, half rap, half modern confessional, partly in direct response to January 6th. She almost upstaged Biden's speech, really. I think this will be one of the memorable items. Not many poems, not many poet laureates made it into the history books. Robert Frost, I mentioned, she'll be the next one. She will not be forgotten. It wasn't a brilliant poem, but there was one line that I immediately noted down. I'll give you now some things that I noted down immediately as these things happened, as Biden spoke, as she spoke, and so on. yesterday. There's always light if only we are brave enough to be it. That's something to mull over in our heads. So, a great moment at a spectacular inauguration somehow. Fox News' Chris Wallace called Biden's inaugural address the best I've ever heard. And he went back all the way to 1961 and John F. Kennedy for comparisons. Most of the formulaic rhetorical moments were there. The fears, the trepidations. It was part sermon, part prep talk, just as they all are. But there's again one line that will stick out and that will become memorable. And I saw that yesterday on the TV networks already several times in different networks from different political quarters. We must end this uncivil war. And he spoke out against white supremacy. And he spoke out against division. And he spoke for tolerance and humility. And he said, and I believe the man, my whole soul is in this. There was, strangely enough, a Martin Luther King moment in that. Not in the rhetorical phrasing, not in the rhetorical delivery, the way I remember it from Barack Obama, but Joe Biden, another Irish Catholic. There's truth and there are lies, he said. Lies are told for power and lies are told for profit. And now we need truth again. We have to face this pandemic as one nation, and I promise you we will get through this together. That's an interesting one, because on the one hand he says, I promise you. On the other hand, time and again throughout this speech, he talked about how he would not be able to do this alone, how they should not look for him implicitly as a savior figure, that this was a challenge to the nation, to us, to we. And another new thing, a silent prayer for the 400,000 dead, for those that couldn't be here any longer. But of course, I promise you, we will be judged, we will write the next great chapter. He quoted the American anthem, talked about thinking not of power but of possibilities, decency, dignity, purpose, resolve. So without ever mentioning the most recent ex-president of the United States, there were all these moments that clearly indicated a 180-degree turn back to a standard of, or towards a new standard. It wasn't so much a turning back, it was a new standard, a new form which now included Amanda Gorman and Lady Gaga and Garth Brooks and really everybody. Don't tell me things can't change. That was a quotation from Barack Obama, close to the end of the whole thing. And in the benediction following him by another African-American, the Reverend Sylvester Beeman, twice repeated, we will make friends of our enemies. So the thing to this part is there, the leadership part was there, the business part started immediately. My whole soul is in this, bringing our nation together again. We'll see whether that happens. The healer role is one that only Joe Biden, from among the candidates, if you let them pass in review for a moment, could fulfill. But the only role model for that in a country increasingly drifting apart. The last president on a similar mission was Jimmy Carter, who, as I said, could not be there yesterday, and he was not successful. And his successor was Reagan, who pushed the country further to the right. But then, what we've seen the last 4 years, as I said initially, was not a presidential performance. It wasn't even an enactment of the presidency like Reagan's. It had nothing of the light-footed, subtle irony that was often visible behind the presidential performance of Barack Obama. It wasn't a burlesque either. It was rather a form of cosplay. It shouldn't surprise us if even the attack on the Capitol looked like a hysterical cosplay, a fantasy LARP event let loose on real life. Last night remained remarkably quiet throughout the United States, surprisingly quiet. However, a return to normalcy probably won't happen. The most recent ex-president of the United States, as he slunk out of Washington yesterday, already announced that he will be back, probably consciously quoting General Douglas MacArthur leaving the Philippines during World War II. It is up to all of us to prevent anything the like of it from happening again. Joe Biden has a remarkably good start as the 46th president. He has already taken on the business, signing presidential executive orders. He has promised to provide leadership, and he is the most likely person in Washington politics these days to reach the synthesis needed right now. If he fails, there'll be the devil to pay again. Or to quote Bertolt Brecht, der Schoß ist fruchtbar noch, aus dem das kroch. Ja, Ende eigentlich. Kommt mal jemand mit nach vorne und hält die Fahne hoch?